I am going to the panel, but I would like first to pass it off to the interpreters to give us a little bit of how interpretation will be handled, and then we'll take it from there.
Hello, everybody. Thank you to all of you for prioritizing language justice for this session. My name is Naira Pacheco, and Alejandra is my co-interpreter. We will be providing interpretation into both English and Spanish, so please feel free to speak in the language you feel most comfortable in during this session. This means that anyone that is not bilingual needs to choose a language channel so that you are set to hear the language you understand. In order to be able to use the interpretation function, you must download the latest version of the Zoom app, either on your phone or your computer, so that you can hear the interpretation. A few guidelines for creating a space with language justice. Please speak one at a time so that we don't have to be in the position to prioritize one person's voice over the other. Please mute your microphone when you are not speaking so that there aren't any echoes or background noises. If you are bilingual, please do not switch between languages within the same sentence or statement. It is hard for interpreters to switch back and forth mid-sentence. Please speak close to the mic and speak up so that we can clearly hear you and interpret accurately so that others receive your message. If we need you to speak up, we will make this sign into the camera, or we will communicate it in the chat. Please also speak at a moderate pace. Remember that interpretation is occurring. Presenters, please be mindful of your pace, especially when reading something off, as we tend to speak even faster when reading. If you are speaking too fast, we will make this signal, or we will communicate it in the chat as well. If you need assistance with interpretation, you can ask for it in the chat as well, and either one of the interpreters or staff can support you with that. And in just a minute, we will, after we finish giving instructions, we will activate the interpretation feature. If you are on a computer, you will see a globe pop up on the bottom of the screen. Click on the globe and select the language you speak. If you are on a cell phone, you will see 3 dots on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and you can click on those and click on language interpretation and then select your language preference. Thank you for your patience as we learn how to best create a bilingual space virtually, and for doing your part in creating language justice. Hola, gracias a todos de ustedes por priorizar justicia del lenguaje. Mi nombre es Naira Pacheco y mi cointérprete es Alejandra. Estaremos proveyendo interpretación en ambos inglés y español, entonces siéntanse cómodos de hablar en el lenguaje que se sientan más cómodos. Esto quiere decir que cualquier persona que no sea bilingüe tiene que escoger un lenguaje en el canal que sea más apropiado para que usted entienda. Para poder usar la función de interpretación, usted debe descargar la versión más actualizada de la aplicación de Zoom, ya sea en su celular o su computadora, para poder escuchar la interpretación. Algunos acuerdos para poder crear un espacio de justicia del lenguaje. Favor, hablen uno a la vez para que no estemos en posición de priorizar la voz de una persona sobre la otra. Favor de poner su micrófono en mudo cuando no esté hablando para evitar ecos o ruido de fondo. Y si usted es bilingüe, favor de no cambiar de lenguajes a mitad de una oración, ya que es muy difícil para los intérpretes hacer ese cambio entre oraciones. Favor de hablar cerca del micrófono en voz alta para que podamos entender su mensaje y comunicárselo a los demás. Si necesitamos que hablen a voz más alta, haremos esta seña o lo comunicaremos en el chat. También favor de hablar en un paso moderado y recuerden que se está realizando interpretación. Para los presentadores, favor de tener en mente el paso en el que hablan, particularmente cuando están leyendo algo, ya que tendemos a hablar más rápido cuando leemos. Y si están hablando demasiado rápido, haremos esta señal o lo comunicaremos en el chat. Si necesitan asistencia con la función de interpretación, nos pueden dejar saber en el chat y uno de los intérpretes o del equipo de personal les puede ayudar. Y en unos momentos después de terminar de dar estas instrucciones, activaremos la función de interpretación. Entonces, si usted está en una computadora, verá un icono de un globo aparecer al fondo a la derecha de su pantalla. Podrá hacer clic en ese globo y seleccionar el lenguaje que usted habla. Y si usted es bilingüe, se puede mantener en la sala principal. Si usted está en su celular, en su teléfono móvil, va a haber 3 puntitos al fondo y a la derecha de su pantalla. Puede hacer clic en ellos y seleccionar interpretación del lenguaje y seleccionar su lenguaje preferido. Gracias por su paciencia y por participar en crear un espacio de justicia del lenguaje. Anaya, puedes activar la función de interpretación ahora. Anaya, you can activate the interpretation feature now.
Good to go.
Gracias, entonces. Thank you so much for all of that. So welcome back again. My name is Erika, and I'll be moderating today's panel. A little bit of background before we kind of jump in and hear from our panelists today. This is a Mi Gente panel. Mi Gente is a national grassroots and digital organizing hub for Latinx and Chicanx changemakers that is pro-Black, pro-queer, pro-women, pro-worker, and pro-planet. We have always organized at the intersections of multiple oppressions and abolish ICE and defund the police we see as 2 lanes that often converge because we are fighting against state violence and the criminalization of Black and Brown communities. We are currently living in a very historic moment that's calling us to organize our people and to push for change that defends Black and Brown lives, improves our communities, and addresses public safety in a different way. So we organized this panel to discuss what policy fights to defund the police can actually look like, how they might be fought for and won from inside local government and from outside in the streets. Because of the history of this nation and its deep roots in white supremacy, it is ingrained in all of us that policing equals public safety. But Black and Brown communities know that to not be true. As police budgets have swollen over the years, levels of violence have remained relatively the same. Policing, like mass incarceration and detention, is a failed model that does not address the root causes of violence, yet serves to grow a local militarized presence in poor and working class communities of color. Spending on police in the US has almost tripled in the last 40 years, from $42.3 billion in 1977 to $114.5 billion in 2017. There has been said to be confusion about what defunding the police means. So we're here to clear up those confusions, to talk strategies, to talk tactics, and to give folks concrete examples of how we're taking this demand and organizing it to make it a reality. So before we start, here are some important stats to consider as we listen to the panelists. America now locks away 2.2 million people. That's a 500% increase from 40 years ago, making the US the country with the largest incarcerated population in the world. ICE's reach has exploded as well, with more people in ICE detention than ever in the history of this nation. Total military spending in the last 20 years has soared from $437 billion in 2003 to $935.8 billion this last fiscal year. More prisons, detention centers, ICE officers, and police mean fewer dollars for the education of our children, for healthcare, and for things that are actually important to bring us up. There are more police inside most of our schools than counselors, and the country spends more money on mass incarceration than it does on public education. I'd like to welcome our panelists, Alma Anaya from Cook County, who is the Cook County Commissioner in Chicago, Illinois. Ricardo Arroyo, City Councilor for District 5 in Boston, Massachusetts. Loyda Colon, Co-Director of Justice Committee and a leading member organization of Communities United for Police Reform in New York City. Carlos Garcia, Councilmember of Council District Number 8 in Phoenix, Arizona. And Claudia Muñoz, Interim Executive Co-Director of Grassroots Leadership in Austin, Texas. Welcome, everyone. You can wave even if we can't hear you. So we're gonna start off with the first question, and everyone's gonna answer it, and then I'll pick, so that way we have like a flow, and you'll have 2 to 3 minutes to answer the first question. How are you understanding this historical moment, and what does defunding the police mean to you, and why is it important? 2 minutes each. We'll start with Carlos.
All right. Thank you. Saludos a todos. Apologize to the viewers that Eric Snowden and Naomi Klein will not be on this panel. I know that's a high level for us to follow. I think you hit a moment in there in your intro that we're talking about institutions that started, whether the first deportation, some of us look at them that they look like the Trail of Tears, or people being moved out of the 13 colonies. Slave patrol started police, things we've heard. And I think connecting that with, we live in a society that's done nothing but declare war on our ills, whether it's poverty, whether it's drugs. We just constantly have this mindset that we're declaring war on anything and everything. That has led us to a completely militarized, I would say we're in a police state. And so this question is basic. I think people overcomplicate it. It's as basic as, instead of funding police, we move our money to invest in communities, especially those communities that are impacted by police. We are also on living a special moment with COVID. And I want to say that it was a trip. Obviously, when I came into council, it's only been a year, I never thought there'd be a moment in time where we'd get a pocket of money, which was the CARES money, and we'd be able to decide where it went and where people were hurting the most and how we can support them. We literally just went through an experiment of how we prioritize our funds and how we should be spending to take care of our people in a crisis. And so now we understand that we're in a policing crisis, and we're in a crisis where people are literally being murdered. We saw the Tucson case come out yesterday. We should react in the same manner. How do we reprioritize? How do we shift our budgets to actually represent the needs of the community? And I think it's being heavily complicated. That was my 2-minute answer, but I really think it's as simple as, if we have $10, where are you gonna spend them? When just really clearing the slate, starting over, what are the priorities our communities have?
Thank you, Carlos. Claudia, I'll move to you.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I think we've learned that moments of urgency can be defining and stepstones towards something else, and that energy has to inevitably go somewhere. We have seen this over and over again with all of the things that have happened in the recent times. And I think for us, we're also understanding that systems are fighting for survival, and it's important to know that, right? Because systems are adapting. So like surveillance tech, intelligent policing, all of that. So for us, really, this is right now a sort of first step towards abolition. I think that we mostly see this moment and a lot of the asks as financial asks right now, but we know that policing is everywhere and in everything by design, and it's a huge system. And yes, it is the infrastructures, but it's also the culture and the practices, and all of the systems that live within us, and needing to create the spaces to talk about that and decolonize from that as well. So I think that's kind of how I see it.
Thank you, Claudia. I'll move to Loyda.
Hey, so I'm actually going to answer the question backwards. So I'm going to answer what does defund mean and then understanding the moment. So defunding the police is based in an understanding that the police don't make us safer, at least not if you're Black or brown, and that this was like never their role, right? The role of the police has always been and continues to be protecting the property interest of white elites and of racist capitalist state, right? Defunding the police is also about the fact that our communities have been defunded for years. Our public health systems, our education systems, housing, and just everything else, right? So defunding the police is about moving the money to protect and build our communities instead of us paying for our people to be incarcerated or criminalized, right? In New York City, when Mayor de Blasio proposed a budget this year, that he proposed huge cuts to key areas like education, youth, community development, but protected the NYPD's budget completely. In New York City, we're demanding that the New York City Council cut at least $1 billion from the NYPD's ridiculous, almost $6 billion budget, and that those funds be invested in programs and infrastructure Black and brown communities need to not just live, but to thrive, right? So understanding this moment is like Justice Committee has been organizing to end police violence since the early 80s. We were created by the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights to support Latinx police killings in New York City, right? This fight is not new for us. We organized around the NYPD chokehold killing of Anthony Baez in the 90s, and then Eric Gardner, right? In like 2014, we worked with his mom for years to get Pantaleo and some of the other cops fired. And during that administrative trial, it was the mother of Anthony Baez sat next to the mother of Eric Gardner every day. I say this to help show that this historical moment is rooted in centuries of Black and brown resistance to oppressive forces. So we're fed up with the city spending billions of dollars to police and criminalize us while denying our communities affordable housing, quality healthcare, education, employment. So to wrap up, the murder of George Floyd and the protest is just the most recent breaking point for Black and brown communities. This is what happens when Black and brown communities collectively say enough. Historically, this is when systemic change is most possible, right? So we saw it in the civil rights movement, in the Stonewall riots, the women's movement, Ferguson, and now, thanks to protests in Missouri, New York City, and all around the country, we have an opportunity right now to transform the system as we know it.
Thank you, Loyda. That was good. That was good.
Try to be fast and slow.
And I'll pass it over to Ricardo.
Thank you. So Loyda said a lot of things that I was going to say, so that, this got shorter for me. But, this moment in time for me is a reflection of the folks who did the work to get us here, right? Like these things don't happen in vacuums. There's been folks talking about defunding police. Angela Davis was talking about this in the 60s, right? And so these are not new ideas. They're not new things that are being pushed. But what I think this moment in time historically is an elevation of that idea into a way where mainstream folks are starting to have conversations about it and having to address it and face it. And so with that in mind, for me, this moment in time is kind of a reminder that direct action gets the goods every single time. And what we've created right now, and thank you to folks watching this, thank you to the folks in the streets. When you're out there doing that as an elected official, that creates the pressure that I need to work within systems to get things done. And so for me, I see this as in a moment of time, a moment where we can leverage the work that people are doing every day on the streets to make sure that we can start pushing those things inside. And so let me jump right into what defunding police means to me. I was a public defender before I was a Boston City Councilor. I had people who had to go to jail because we didn't have enough beds, so they had to wait 3-4 months to get treatment beds. I had people who had to wait in jail because we couldn't get mental health beds. I had folks who weren't getting educated in the way that they needed to, and they weren't being given opportunities to go into different streams of income and different ways of living their life and given the opportunity to live the healthy lives that they deserve. And we didn't have funding for any of that. Underfunding was never a dirty word, right? Defunding, I've heard a lot of folks that are in my inbox right now about how defunding needs to be redefined as something else, or you got to change the way that you say that word. But underfunding never got that kind of outcry. I know because I was in those underfunded schools. And so our folks have been yelling about underfunding for a long time. And now we're talking about something. I'll just talk for our city. I'm in Boston. We had our budget vote yesterday. We're in the middle of a pandemic. The Boston police budget is 250% higher than the entirety of all 8 departments that live in health and human services. Those are departments that work with seniors, with vets, with youth, with youth employment, with mental health. All 8 departments put together, the budget for police is 250% higher than that. And so when we talk about health and safety, and I think it's really important to define this, safety is provided by funding programs, funding things we know work, funding opportunities. Security is a totally different question. And what police provide for some folks is the idea of security. Something bad is happening. Police are going to come in here. They're going to resolve that. I would question whether or not we see that in our communities work out that way. But what I would certainly say is police will tell you, they'll tell you themselves, they don't solve crime. They solve crimes perhaps, but they don't solve what creates or causes it. And so if we're going to invest money, and this is what defunding means for me, if we're going to invest money in something, I'd rather invest it in the cure that deals with the systemic problems that create those issues than something that's only going to treat or attract to the symptoms. And I think it's important to understand that the reason that we have funding divested from our communities and from our programming is because white supremacy exists, systemic racism exists, and those are the priorities which they set aside for us. And so for me, that's what defunding means. And when we talk about this moment in time, I just want to keep saying, keep the pressure up because it's getting things done. So thank you to folks. And I see this as a step in a chain link of all the different links and times in which we've moved this ball forward. And so thank you to folks that are doing that. And I hope that wasn't too fast for our interpretation. I'm sorry if it was.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm going to pass it over to Alma.
Thank you, Erika, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this very important conversation. I mean, it's all been said so beautifully, and just straight to the point. I think in the context that we're seeing now in this global pandemic, we're in a state of emergency, and we've had many states of emergencies, right, throughout the history of this country. But reality is that this is our time in history to take action, to really see what we can do as a collective, as we the people, right, to really make meaningful change with the oppressive systems that continue to harm our communities. You know, I was undocumented most of my life. Now I'm in elected office, but I always remember the fear that me and my family had towards police. They're not there to protect, they're there to oppress in a lot of areas, specifically here in the city of Chicago and in Cook County. You know, very similarly to the other cities that have been highlighted. Just last year, there was a push for a $95 million police academy that was passed at the city council. This is something that is, while we're seeing that the funding is not going anywhere else in our communities. Just a few years back, 50 public schools, majority in Black and Latino neighborhoods, were closed. We saw, you know, 6 out of the 12 mental health clinics that were available for the public, 6 of them closed. So, I mean, the reality is that there's always been underfunding and disinvestment in a lot of the communities, and it's a way to oppress and to continue to justify structural racism. And to us, you know, defunding police, defunding, again, law enforcement agencies means just exactly that, what's been highlighted. Why should children, you know, be in schools where they don't have, you know, the books and technology that's available to them? Why do we have to incarcerate somebody or detain somebody for them to get any type of substance abuse help or mental health assistance? Again, these are the things that we're seeing systematically, and now more than ever, we need to make sure that we're standing up and that we're working together to show that there's a better way and that there's a better future for our communities. And the only way to do that is to be able to address the real issues that are at hand. And again, it's a very deep-rooted historical racist and oppressive system that continues to use the police, ICE, continues to use even, you know, emergency management, Homeland Security, all of those agencies to demonize Black and brown bodies. And this is the time where we need to unify to go against that and to really ask and demand the true justice that we need for our communities and the resources that we must have for our children, for the futures, but also for our communities. So I think that's, you know, that's where we're at, and this is more than ever the time to do have these conversations and do that.
Thank you, Alma. And thank you all of you for those great responses. And I think there's a lot of like similarities. People are kind of like talking about the same things and needs. So I wanted to actually, as we talk about what defunding means, and like what our vision for defunding could look like, I want to give space for some of you to talk about what you've been working on to actually make that demand possible, or either right now if there's a campaign that you're working on, or historically, and where you've pushed to maybe have some of those resources go. And I wanted to start with Loyda to talk about in New York, like some of the historic campaigns. Yeah.
Historic campaigns.
Or like, how are you working right now to do the demand of defunding the police? You know, 'cause that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the New York City movement's demand that the NYPD budget be cut by at least $1 billion is also a demand that all monies cut from the NYPD and any related savings be reinvested in our communities. And that's important because we got to watch them because they're moving kind of sneaky. Even those considering like defunding police, they're not talking about the whatever money is saved from that actually going to our communities. They're actually sneakily trying to move it into other places that doesn't benefit our communities at all. So there's so many places the money can go and should go. New York City was the epicenter, right, of COVID deaths for a long time. The communities that were most devastated by the pandemic are Black, Latinx, and other communities of color. Like in our communities that had the most deaths, the most infections, the most people who lost their jobs, right, their income, and losing our homes, right? Like that is real and a real reason to defund NYPD and put money into our communities. The reason Black and brown communities were hit the hardest is clear. It's our communities that have been defunded for years. So we don't have good health care. Many of us didn't have ways to do social distancing. It's our people who were the essential workers that kept the city going, whether in hospitals, food deliveries, like driving buses. Our communities are also the ones that are brutalized by the police every day. Our demand is that we need to stop funding police and we need to do huge investments in our communities. So that, I mean, right? Does that answer the question?
That was good. That was good. That answers the question. And how about you, Claudia? In Texas, what has been the demand in Austin, and how are you guys working to make that happen?
Yeah, so we do have an active defunding campaign that builds on years of work at Grassroots leadership. And our main demand right now is that our police department is disbanded within 5 years, starting with tangible defunding. We're actually about to start budget process. The first draft is coming to the public, I think, on July 13th. I don't think that's the day that's coming up. And so we're kind of well positioned for that. So I think right now we're just digging into as much as we can into the framing of policing as a whole framework, right? Asking for the most that we can, really knowing where every cent is going to and linking that to gentrification, education, prisons, and jails. And again, really expanding into other sources of funding for policing, like contracts on surveillance and tech, and external funding as well. Our police department has a $1 million contract with the Department of Justice. And so what we're seeing is that even if we're able to completely defund them, they're always going to find other sources of funding. And, we're also a community building organization. So we're doing a lot of base work with undocumented people and formerly and currently detained and incarcerated people. I think a lot of our folks know, right, that police and policing are violent, but I think sometimes because of, again, assimilation and colonization, we don't have the spaces to break those things away from us. So we're doing a lot of work in creating some of those spaces to bring folks along and really asking the questions like, what do we already know and what do we need to make space for, defining things together. And we definitely want money to go towards housing, education, reparations. Austin went from being 25% Black to being 8% Black in less than 10 years. And And so it's been a lot of violence committed, and we don't want those conversations to be separate. We really want them to be one of the same. So just doing a lot of work around that.
Thank you, Claudia.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also say, you know, just because I want to kind of throw in the Philly perspective, which is kind of my job, right? That in Philly today, we actually had an announcement that we did not get the budget demands that we wanted from the city council. So they tried to say, kind of like New York, that they were decreasing the budget by $33 million. But in reality, what they did was they played the shell game, like the 3-card Monte, where they said they like took the money away, but they actually moved part of the force under a different department. So it just didn't appear inside the police budget anymore. And so, you know, one of the things that we've been kind of wrestling with has been like, what does it mean for council, right? Like when we talk about these things. And so I feel like, you know, Ricardo, I saw your video that you posted about your response as one of the few council members in Boston to vote no on the budget. And I want to say, one, that like we're very happy that you stood by your values on that. Could you talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing around the demand to defund the police as a council person, and where you would want to see those resources go?
So I think, so thank you. And so I think the first thing I want to tell anybody listening to this is the power to defund police and really revert our funding back to these places where they're underfunded lie with your municipal bodies, right? So like it's not necessarily your governor or your president. It is very likely your city council and your mayor that are deciding your budget priorities. And so from that level, you should know that that's who's doing that work, and that's who you should be banging the doors on. And so in Boston, we had a 10% request. We wanted 10% of the total DPD budget. That was $41 million for context. The mayor's response was to cut $10 million from overtime spending. The problem with cutting overtime spending is that overtime spending, we have to pay it statutorily. So if they use it, you could cut it however you want to do it. But if they use it, they're going to get that paid to them anyway. And so a $10 million cut that you could argue isn't a real cut until we see it, right? For context, last year, we budgeted $65 million in overtime, or $60 million in overtime, and they're around $70 million in usage, right? So for context. And so basically a 10 million cut that may or may not be real, I'll believe it when I see it, but that's nowhere near 41 million. And so I want to also shout out my colleagues of color. Every person who voted against this budget was a person of color, and there was not a single white ally or accomplice on the other side of this. And I think it's important to note that even in something like this, where the demands of communities of color were being lifted up, where those demands were being lifted up by councilors of color, it's really important to understand that, you know, if you want to be an ally, if you want to be an accomplice, it really means listening, and beyond listening, it means action. And in this instance, we unfortunately didn't get that. We didn't get that far, but this isn't the only budget we're going to do. We got another one next year. And what I would say is the groundwork in the beginning of these seeds have planted beliefs in folks that this is somewhere we can go. This is doable. This is accessible, and we can keep pushing for this. And I think that as we move forward in the next year, this isn't going away, right? I think every year, every budget, folks are going to be having this conversation. That's thanks to the work of folks on the ground. And we have to continue that. As an elected official, I'm trying to continue that. And so I can just say that they did not meet our full demands, but the fact that we even got 10%, that wasn't planned. That was due to the direct action of so many folks that forced 10 million out into Health and Human Services. And that's something to be applauded. And I think what we're arguing is incremental change isn't successful change for us. It's not enough change. And so we're going to keep fighting that. But I think that's the step we're doing, right? We just keep the pedal down and we keep going head down. And so, you know, I think we're making progress, and we're already further than anybody thought we would be last year, right? So it's just keep pushing and keep your head down.
Thank you, Ricardo. I think it's also important as we talk about what people have been fighting for on the ground, and like what it looks like for you to have voted like that, you know, and like the kind of, I do think there's a moment where we need to be asking people to have political courage around some of these moments and fights. And I also think that there are real barriers that like sometimes we don't discuss, like what is holding back, for example, in some of our cities, elected officials for actually saying loudly, like, this is what we believe in. So I wanted to give Carlos some time, maybe talk a little bit about what you have won in Arizona, and also like what have been some of the biggest blocks to getting wins, like who, what institutions, things like that.
Yeah, and so I want to start off by reminding everyone this is Arpaio country, right? We have the sheriff Arpaio, who 10 years ago, 70% of the Latinx community supported before we started doing any sort of work around them. So there's different contexts and different places that we're at. But we were able to get something done earlier this year, which we didn't think was going to be possible for a long time. So we had a flashpoint. Literally the first meeting I was in council, a week before, officers had pulled out a gun on a pregnant woman and some children, and the video went viral. So it created the space, the Ames family, for us to start the conversation about civilian oversight. And we were able to accomplish something. There's civilian review boards, different offices across the country, but we were able to accomplish something with ours this year, that we're actually now going to insert someone inside the internal affairs investigation itself. And so for the first time, officers aren't going to be able to just magically investigate themselves behind closed door. We're actually going to have a community person that's going to be inside these investigations. So at the same time that we win that, they cut the funding because of COVID. And then right as we're finalizing our budget, this moment happens and it shifts everything. We literally have a vote on a Wednesday, this is 2 weeks ago, and the budget fails because people didn't want to fund the new Office of Accountability and Transparency. We then have to call an emergency meeting 4 days after on a Monday, and everybody flips. And we now go to a 7-2. We even had a Republican come over and say, fine, we're going to get this. Then on our final budget vote, which was last week, we actually go in with the defund demand. And obviously that doesn't go well. And we lose that, and we end up being the only office, 1 out of 8, that voted against the budget. All that to say, it's not a loss. The conversation is now different. And we literally saw it within days of people being in the streets that we were able to fund this office and start a conversation about defund. Now, we haven't really talked about what prohibits us from doing this. And I think the police unions are the number one. FOP, Police Association, whatever it's called, wherever you're at, they function in the same way. And there's a saying in Spanish, and they've been amazing at this, of being a barril sin fondo, of being a barrel without, they don't fill. And they've been amazing at year after year, regardless of how much money they get, they're crying and complaining that they don't have enough. You need more officers. You ain't safe. Our call times are too long. Whether they manipulate them or not, that's the constant that they have. And they've been doing that for as long as I can remember. And so that's the same type of work we're going to have to do. This knowledge of what safety means, and that police is what provides that, and that there's never enough money we can give them. They've been on a 30, 40-year campaign to assure that that's our reality. And we're going to have to be willing, although we have this flashpoint where we can move probably 10 years ahead, we need to have the discipline to maintain those demands. And that as next year, just like how Abolish ICE kind of slowed down, we need to make sure that the defund the police does not go away, and that it actually becomes a demand and something that's sustainable, and that we're pushing it at all levels. Final thing is that officers know who their base is. They know who they're counting on. They know, and they're building on the scapegoating and fear-mongering of communities of color that's been ingrained in our society for 500 years. And so it's easy for them to tap into that. I was sharing with Erika earlier, because we had a conversation. There's now a feature on Facebook that when you get targeted with an ad, you could check how they targeted you. And our police association, so I happen to get targeted, I don't know why, but then I pull it up and the first line says, anyone that likes Fox News or likes Donald Trump. And it's obviously not a secret, but they know what they're doing and they know what they're tapping into. And I think it's a broader narrative question we have to do, along with a substantive organizing plan that shows the alternative. And I think what Ricardo said is right on, is actually finding solutions, finding how to fund people. The last thing I promise, someone, I think Sylvia, who keeps asking the question, on the Facebook page of, if I'm a victim of a crime, what do we do? And that's just real. It's real shit, right? If you're getting mugged, someone's taking your car, what are you gonna do? And it's not an easy question. As similar to Alma, I grew up undocumented with an entire undocumented family, and my uncles would sometimes get out of pocket because they were drinking or whatever. We had to figure it out ourselves because we knew if we counted on the police, it might mean one of us was no longer going to be there and they were going to be deported. And so our communities have found ways of doing that. It's just a matter of matching that to city resources. What is it that we actually need when these situations are happening? What is it that our community needs? And it's a long-term thing. And so when it comes to that, it's a real question, and I don't think there's a real answer because we are never given the grace to actually have these conversations of what happens when someone's mugged and they need support. What does the support for that person look like? Both the person that's committing the act and the person that's being taken. And so to be expected to be able to answer that after we have 500 years of doing things one way, I think is unfair. And we should be okay with saying, like, that's a valid question. Let's figure it out together. Let's move on that together.
Thank you, Carlos. I really appreciate the perspective. Also, because I actually had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with somebody who's a rape survivor and who never went to the police, how much women don't trust the police, women of color in particular, around those instances. And we absolutely need some other way that can hold people accountable, but also doesn't have to be punitive, but actually is restorative, because most women who don't go to the police wind up having to figure out how to rectify that experience on their own or inside of their own community. So I appreciate that, because I think that's a big question that people have. Alma, I also want to give you some time to speak to the Chicago experience, right? And like, what have been some of the barriers that you have seen? Like in Philly also, I know Chicago has a huge getting police out of schools. I know that Arizona had that as well. And so like, what have been some of the barriers that you have witnessed to this vision of defunding police and cutting their contracts?
Sure. So I'll start off a little bit with some of the accomplishments, and then I'll continue on with the barriers, and I'll try to be very brief. But I think, you know, I've been in elected office for about a year and a half. One of the first things that I did was pass an ordinance to get rid of a gang, quote unquote, gang database that the sheriff had. We found out about this in Chicago because a man from my district ended up getting detained and deported because he was apparently on this list that he had no idea he was a part of. After a lot of investigations, after getting a lot of the universities involved and looking into these practices, they realized that the police and the Cook County Sheriff were using these databases that were blanketing areas and criminalizing Black and brown bodies, just mentioning that they were gang members. And it was things as simple as like a tattoo, right? It was as simple as like, you know, they were wearing something that may have been, you know, showing association to a gang. And it ended up impacting so many Black men and incarcerating them, but also affecting the Latino and immigrant community, because there was deportations. After finding out, the sheriff had been sharing this list openly with 400 different other agencies and municipalities, including ICE. So that was a huge problem on our end, because this information wasn't validated. And again, it was used to oppress and to criminalize individuals. So getting rid of that was an uplifting. I think that there's always this, you know, it was mentioned previously, oh, well, we need this data, we need this information, we have to keep people safe. And there's always an excuse for all of the measures. There's always an excuse for, you know, the millions of dollars that they waste on tasers. There's always an excuse for any of the databases that they're creating. There's always an excuse for the millions and billions of dollars that they're spent on these contracts that in reality don't make anybody safer, but create more fear towards police. I mean, Erika, you just mentioned, there's so many people of color that fear the police. They don't want to go to the police. They do not trust them. And it's because of the tactics that they've been using historically. It's because of the type of training that they undergo. It's a militarization of police agencies and law enforcement agencies that continue to harm communities. So in reality, getting rid of that, I mean, I had the sheriff's office almost every day in my office. They had calls, they had other, it was a lot of pressure, but in reality, because it was a movement from grassroots organizations and it was a true collaboration, we were able to accomplish that. And now looking back, I think that these are the type of things we need to be looking at. And we will continue to have barriers on that end. But what I've been doing on my end, and I've been, to some extent, I think I've been successful in bringing the conversation even before even before COVID, even before the George Floyd and the movement into defunding police. We've been having real conversations with the board, with my colleagues, to be quite frank, people who are trying to understand these contracts, trying to understand these memorandums of understandings that local agencies and municipalities and law enforcement have with federal agencies. We receive millions of dollars in grants to turn over names of undocumented individuals that come in, that interface with the system. So it's about really dissecting where the money is coming from and cutting those ties, because in reality, any type of tie that we have with those agencies and any type of information sharing that we're giving them, that tries to validate the way that they function and the way that they oppress individuals. So to me, it's been two-faced, right? It's been a little bit of looking at the policy and looking at the funding that we are allocating for those entities, instead of restorative practices, instead of violence prevention grants, instead of mental health, instead of schools. But it's this other component as well that is looking at what the federal government is asking of municipalities and what their partnerships currently are, and also understanding that funding that they're receiving from the federal government is actually in return of something. And we need to open our eyes and understand that there hasn't been any push on that end as well, and we need to be looking at both sides.
Thank you, Alma. We have a little bit of time left to make sure that all of our panelists get about a minute or two to be able to answer one final question, and also to share anything that you would like for folks who are listening right now to get involved locally, whether that's in an organization or to follow you on Twitter. This is kind of like your last opportunity to say the last thing. And I will start by saying that I am an abolitionist. I have been an abolitionist for a very long time. And I think that abolition has become kind of a dirty word, and people seem to not want to talk about that openly. But so the question for me is, how do we in this moment organize with the framework of abolition, and what is your vision long-term for public safety? And I will start with Loyda.
So abolition isn't just about tearing stuff down, right? And I think a lot of people think that way. But abolition is not just about tearing. It isn't just about tearing things down. It's mostly about building things up, right? So when we think about safety, we need to think about what communities are considered, what communities consider safety. Safe. The safest communities aren't the communities with the most police, right? It's the communities with the most resources that are actually the safest. We need to demand the resources our communities need, so that everyone has housing, everyone has food, everyone has income, everyone has access to art and joy, right? And everyone has what they need to survive and thrive. That's how we're going to get our communities safe. Using an abolitionist framework means that we have a clear power analysis and that every step we take should be about taking away power from the police and building up the power of our people. I'll leave it at that. And yes, we have a petition that I can't share at the moment. We seem to be having issues right now. So we have a petition, and we actually have a social media action all day tomorrow. I plan to get that stuff to Mi Gente crew, and it should go out in the email, the follow-up email.
So thank you, Loyda. I really appreciate that perspective. I will pass it off to Claudia. Same question.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think abolition is a collective
No se te
project.
escucha muy bien, Claudia.
Okay, sorry. Is this better? Okay, so yeah, abolition is definitely a collective project, right? Justice safety is a collective project. I definitely don't see policing as part of it. I think the only justification for policing is service and safety. And I think that, you know, we've done that. We continue to do that for each other. I will say, though, I think as an immigrant, an undocumented immigrant, currently in deportation proceedings, the only way to reach abolition is to reject assimilation. You know, I think for us, we see that our immigrant folks come here and out of survival go towards assimilation. So I think as we're thinking of creating spaces, like we have to keep that in mind, especially around policing. Definitely found out that, you know, when people come here and they didn't have functioning police systems in their home country, sometimes it makes it seem like a strong or functioning police system is like what you need. So we have to create spaces for people to reimagine what safety looks like as immigrants. And I think right now it's been such an amazing opening to have this conversation, and it's a moment of a lot of questioning, but also a lot of creation, which as a community we can do very well.
Te lo paso a ti, Ricardo.
Thank you. And so what I would say on this is, for me, when I think about like a long-term vision of public safety, and I was a public defender, so it's hard for me to think about policing without the context also of our court systems and our incarceration state, right? And so the reality is a lot of these things work together. It's like a cog in a machine. They feed one and it feeds the other, and there's a lot of money made off of that, and there's a lot of money put into that. I have had in my life maybe 500, 600 different clients. And the reality is I wouldn't have had a single one of those clients, I truly believe this, if they had been given the opportunities and the treatment and the things that they needed. And the reality is we don't fund those things. And so when I think about this, I think about it from the difference between security and safety. I need security when I don't take care of those things. When I don't take care of somebody's needs, either physical, emotional, or you know, just their ability to have a home and a place to eat and a job, then I have to expect that you're going to have to try and do something to figure out that. And if I'm not taking care of those things for you, if I'm not giving you opportunities, if I'm not giving you that treatment, sometimes a manifestation of that is violence. Sometimes a manifestation of that is theft or crime or things that we think of as symptoms. And for me, a long-term vision of safety means the more funding you put in dealing with that, the less money you're going to even need for policing, right? And I think they get more in terms of what they're getting in right now than for what they are for output. We're no safer in our streets when we have more police. We are safer when we talk, we might have more security. We are safer when we dedicate funding to these things. And so for me, a long-term vision as far as abolition goes, you know, I don't know that I'm an expert on abolitionist frameworks or abolitionist theories. Some I'm still learning and trying to really decipher. But what I do know is that I believe in the stuff that I say. I believe in the data. And I believe that if we give money to these things, if we put our time and our attention into these things, that will lead to less crime. And if you have less crime, then a lot of the reasons for why we justify policing don't need to exist. And so that's how I understand it in the context of how I understand it.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm going to pass it off to you, Alma.
Thank you. So I think an abolitionist framework needs, it's not only just that, right? I think it's along the same lines of what I'm understanding Ricardo to say. It's also looking at the other frameworks that haven't worked, right? So we have to examine the school to prison pipeline. We have to examine the the industrial complexes. We need to examine the state of social welfare and social services in our systems. And we need to be looking at that to be able to cure the illnesses that have been created for so long. But the reality of it is that we haven't had ICE all of our lives. ICE was just created, less than, I think it's since after 2011 in 2003. There was a life without ICE. There was a life without police. And we need to understand that we don't necessarily need to continue funding these agencies when in reality they haven't solved our world problems. If anything, it's created so much more, and it's uplifted, the systems of that we've mentioned earlier, right? The capitalism, it's protecting the people that it's meant to protect. And in reality, we need to understand that we didn't have these before, and we need to move into a framework, not only in government agencies, not only in those entities, but also as a society, because let's not forget that there's still a lot of people, of color that still don't understand that and still do not believe in that. So it needs to be something that we're moving forward, again, as a society, but also looking into the systems and the structural issues that we've been living under. And the reality is that we could get there. We just need to, stay focused and understand everything that's behind the scenes, and everything, how it has really evolved into again, the illnesses that we live on day to day.
Gracias, Alma. And I'm going to pass it off to Carlos to finish up with the answer to that question.
No pressure. I'm trying to put different thoughts together. I think I started off with saying this country was obviously created, and it was an experiment in white supremacy that has only accommodated itself or shifted different laws or situations based on its economic needs, and figuring out different ways to continuing to exploit Black and brown and poor bodies. And so I think it's interesting, Claudia, that you brought on the assimilation piece, because I think most people think about that in a cultural sense of whiteness, but detach that from the systematic oppression or the systems that come upon us. And so I literally saw someone asking on the Facebook, expand on the assimilation piece. And I think it's right that it's connected to the abolition piece, because what we're trying to abolish is white supremacy, homophobia, all these horrible things that have oppressed us and put us in the situation we are now. And so I would say that's right. So as long as we continue to assimilate and accept the systems that give us the results of seeing what happened to George Floyd or Carlos Lopez yesterday in Tucson, then you're accepting that, and therefore you're not changing it, and therefore you're not abolishing it. And so if we continue to do the same thing, if we can, back to the original question of this conversation, if we continue to fund police and allow them to continue this path, we're gonna get the same results. And it's literal insanity to think that we don't defund these police departments and somehow they're no longer gonna hurt us and kill us in the way that they have. And so I think it's right. It's literally detaching us from this white supremacist experiment that some of us now represent. I literally, am now part of the government. I represent the city of Phoenix. We have 9 council people, and so I have over 200,000 people within my district. That's who I represent, and I have to come to the reality that I also represent, and my job is to hold accountable the officers that are murdering people. And so that's the situation we find ourselves in, and it doesn't mean we can't seek these different answers to shift these things, to abolish the way those systems are. Is it gonna mean that we might not be in this position next year? Is it gonna mean that some of us are gonna lose what we have? Absolutely. But I think that if this moment and COVID has taught us anything, is to really look at ourselves as to what we value, who are the real people keeping us safe, and when we're in a crisis like a healthcare crisis, and how are we going to move forward defunding the systems that we've literally been paying to murder and kill us and separate our families. And so super grateful. Wish we could continue the conversation, but I see it's 2 p.m. So I'm going to stop right there, Erika.
2 p.m. where you are. It's 5 p.m. here in Philly.
Okay.
And I want to
Remember,
thank.
everything's centered around Arizona. We're the center of the world. That's
Yeah,
what
we
you're always
talked about this before. Yes, I would say people in New York and Boston would beg to differ. I want to thank y'all for this wonderful conversation. Ricardo, Loyda, Alma, Claudia, Carlos. I hope that we can have more moments like this. I love spending time with y'all. I really encourage everybody who's watching to keep the conversation up, get organized, get involved. Join Mi Gente. You can go to Mi Gente at migente.net/join. Make sure to get involved in that way to keep up with anything that happens in the future. Keep fighting, keep luchando, and we'll see you on the other side. Thanks, everyone.